In this series of the On Being Human podcast, we explore this idea that everything that we experience, whether it's a culture, a system, a person, even ourselves, was first born as an idea in the mind of somebody else. And then this idea was turned into a story. So everything that we experience in our lives was born first in the form of a story. But sometimes these stories can take on lives of their own. And we're wanting to invite you into an exploration of what happens when we outgrow a story. What happens when we're not fully aware of the inherent limitations that come with a particular story as opposed to another. How do we start to curiously and gently look at the stories that shape our lives, the lives of those around us, and the cultures that we live in? And how do we start to tease away and create space maybe for some new stories to come in? Our episodes take place in 3 parts. So we will begin by introducing just the conversation that we're having with one of our guests. At the end of a short conversation, you will hear the guest introduce themselves to you so that you might understand a little bit better where their stories came from or who's underneath the stories. And then in the 3rd part, Rob and I have a reflection conversation based on some of the concepts or ideas or things that came out of the first part of the conversation. In this 3rd part, we introduce some poems or articles or other references that could be helpful for you to start to look a little bit deeper into your own explorations around the stories that have shaped who you are today. We hope you enjoy this series of the On Being Human podcast. So, Rob, when you think about the myths and the stories that in some way shape your own human experience, what's the first thing that comes to mind?
The first thing that comes to mind is I think I've got quite a lot of stories and myths that float around in my... Well, actually, I think primarily it's probably in my head, but some of them are in my body as well. My first thought is, wow, yeah, I have lots. And I think the more I reflect on them, I realize that some of those stories are really helpful and I can build on them. Some of the stories are really loud and they're really unhelpful. They're not my story. They are someone else's story.
Give us an example of one of those stories and how it helps shape your human experience.
You're good with people. Yeah, would be a helpful story for me.
So what does the story of you're good with people, what does that enable for you? What does that open up?
I suppose there's something about it reminds me. It reminds me of a part of me that sometimes I doubt or I can forget if things are difficult or tricky, or maybe something's happening where the feedback I'm getting is, I'm not doing something very well with people. There's this bigger story that I'm reminded of. I have something that I can sit in almost, and I suppose that's a story that is partly my story that I've created about myself over the years as I've watched myself and in the work and stuff. And also that's a story that I say I get fed back to me. So it's really nice when those two stories, the two sources connect, which feels very different than sometimes when you feel that I feel a dissonance between stories, between my story and someone else's story.
Could you trace back, where do you think this story originated? So if you looked at how old is this story, how long has this been around?
Probably when I was about 11, 12.
What happened then?
Partly in school, partly in sort of part of a youth group where I said I found myself listening a lot to other people Yeah, from a genuine desire to hear other people. And I think then you start getting the feedback from your friends. I was sat in the kitchen, I can remember it very distinctly, with a friend called John. And he sat down and he looked at me and he said, "Wow, if it hadn't been for you, I'm not sure where I would be over these last few years, because you've just been a space where I could talk and be me." So it's little bits like that, and that anecdotal stuff that you think, "Oh, okay." There are lots of those different examples when people form the story. I do wonder sometimes whether the story also appeared as a story of, that's what we would like you to be. So from parents and other people, formative adults, because that's the value that they valued, people who were good with people, as opposed to what else was going on for my life at that moment was a lot of music. So I did consider doing music as a career, but I got really strong feedback from formative adults of, "Oh, that I wouldn't worry about that. It's not a value." So even in the one about you're good with people, I can still feel something else alongside it as well. And for me, it's not a both and or both or. Sorry, it's a both and. Yeah, I can be good with people and I can do music. But at the time, I wonder now whether there was some favoring something in the stories that I heard, mainly from adults, not necessarily peers, but mainly from adults or formative adults.
How do you feel that may have shaped your life going forward? The favoring of the one story over the other.
I think what it's meant is that I have unexplored and unexpressed parts of me, of how I'd want to be in the world. I've had 40 years of being good with people and getting paid to be good with people. And there's other part of me thinking, "Oh, I'd really like to have been paid to be good at music." And that bit's still there. It hasn't gone away. It's not regret, but there's sometimes there's a sadness and a curiosity about a wonder what would have happened if I'd kept that going as well and I hadn't favored, because I ended up favoring it, I think, according to other people's favoring, if you like.
Fascinating.
I was going to say, in the nature of this being a shared podcast, are you okay if I swap the roles?
Sure.
So what comes up for you, Eveline, when you think around these myths or these stories?
I have a really strong one that pops up, and that may be primed by what you said about, a story that I have internalized that I'm not sure was my own, but was more fed to me within a certain narrative, but I definitely integrated, which is the story that I am too naive for this world. And so if I circle back to the origin of that story, I would say I was always quite a dreamy child, so spent a lot of time in my own imaginary fantasy worlds. And I did have a certain naivety in me, but maybe all children do, or most children do. But I also have a quite strong, probably one of my primary values is compassion or generosity or something along, that line. And it has the way that a story has been sculpted around that kindness and generosity, I think, is through this use of the language of naivety.
Okay.
Right. So I have examples from when I was young where I did things for children in my class that are quite funny if you look at them now in retrospect, but at the time, a little bit out of the ordinary, right? So consistently give away my lunches. And it wasn't that I was at a school where kids didn't have their own lunches. In that sense, in that case, it may have made some sense. But these were all kids who had their own food. And yet I chose to do this sort of sacrificial thing almost, or this very classical story of, I was born and raised in South America. And so we were at a school that was on a hill. and we had to walk several flights of stairs up to the gymnasium where we had gym. And I would offer to carry my classmates' backpacks up the stairs. And I don't really know why I felt compelled to do that. And so I've always had this very strong sort of orientation around generosity and compassion. But the story that was woven around that was, yeah, that's really naive. It's too naive, and you're going to get hurt.
Sure. There are two or three things that came up for me when you were talking about. One is that I wish you'd been at my school, because I remember at my school there were like 3 or 4 flights of big stairs, and I'd really liked a friend who I'll carry your bag for you. So that was the first one. But I suppose what I was really struck by was I heard you describing that some of the stories and the myths that are created by others and they're placed on top of what we do.
Yeah.
And that becomes a bit of maybe, I mean, you talk becomes a little bit sort of problematic to do these, to be compassionate, to do these things. How does that myth turn up in your life now? How's that story alive in your life now?
I think it shapes what I'm interested in doing professionally, right? So I work in the areas of facilitation and coaching, and also creatively creating spaces where people can have greater access to experiences and tools that will enhance their well-being. I'm constantly seeking out ways in which, actually, in the integration of all the pain, all the darkness in the world, we get to create more light, right? So my orientation is always towards the light. My initial sort of company name that I generated for myself was silver lining, right? So it's something to do with the silver lining. So I think that myth very much steers how I am in the world and what I do in the world.
And I'm really struck by hearing you talk then about how it informs your life, and then how that almost jars with the myth of naivety. Do you know what I mean? There's this other myth around that, you're just being naive. No, I'm being compassionate. I'm being this. I'm being of service. I want to bring the alchemy to this to create light out of pain and suffering.
Hello, I'm Rob Husband. I'm one of the hosts of the On Being Human podcast. I'm a father of 3 beautiful adult children who teach me probably more than anyone else about the human experience. I'm a coach, facilitator, and therapist, and I have a great affinity with the natural world. I love being outdoors, sleeping under the stars, swimming in the rivers and the sea. I just realised that I have a really strong need to be in that space. And just really excited too about exploring what it means to be a human being, the complexities, the simplicities, and the paradoxes around what it means to live as a human being, especially in this time in our species sort of development.
Hello, I am Eveline van den Heuvel. I'm also one of the podcast hosts. I am a mother of a beautiful daughter, Zoe, and I would probably describe myself as someone who has had a very strong solo focus on, some people might call it the shy soul, others may call it the inner flame that burns within us. Whatever it is that yearns in our insides to express itself and come out in a creative, human, expressive way. It was the place that I was interested in exploring even as a child, very connected to my intuition, and also spent lots of time alone with animals and in nature. And I think it's driven the choices that I've made throughout my life, including a decision to study neuroscience and psychology, but also a drive to explore areas such as meditation, breathwork, yoga, and even explore different parts of the world. I like being connected with different people, all kinds of shapes and sizes and flavors and voices, to help me understand better what that inner yearning is within each of us. So I think that's how I describe myself.
So welcome. Here is where we reflect back on the conversation we've had. So earlier on, me and Eveline had a conversation where we started to talk about our own myths and stories that appeared. This part of the podcast is when we look back on that conversation, we do some reflection on what were the themes that appeared, what were the things that jumped out at us, and then we speak to those a little bit. So we don't go back into the conversation about our own myths and stories necessarily, but we're going to maybe bring in other writers. We might bring in some poetry or some other thinkers around the stuff that we've noticed. So that's what we're going to do for this second part. And hopefully that gives you a little bit of material to go away and do a little bit of your own thinking and your own reflection. Eveline, what was the thing that jumped out for you?
So I think I was really struck in both of our conversations how we went back to quite an early stage in our lives. So we both spoke of a memory or a time when we were quite young, and there was something maybe essential about, who we already were in this world, and then how that got interpreted by others, or what story got told about who we were. And that story that others told maybe then shaped our own relationship to the unique quality or gift or whatever that we're expressing in the world. As I was thinking a little bit further about it, I was reminded of a beautiful, really small book that was written by the Quaker teacher, I don't know what else he is, Parker J. Palmer. It's called Let Your Life Speak. And I actually have a little passage of it that I would like to read for us. So he writes, "If you doubt that we all arrive in this world with gifts, and as a gift, pay attention to an infant or a very young child. A few years ago, my daughter and her newborn baby came to live with me for a while. Watching my granddaughter from her earliest days on Earth, I was able, in my early 50s, to see something that had eluded me as a 20-something parent. My granddaughter arrived in the world as this kind of person, rather than that, or that, or that. She didn't show up as raw material, but to be shaped into whatever image the world might want her to take. She arrived with her own gifted form, with the shape of her own sacred soul. Biblical faith calls it the image of God in which we are all created. Thomas Merton calls it true self. Quakers call it the inner light, or that of God in every person. The humanist tradition calls it identity and integrity. No matter what you call it, it's a pearl of great price." So that's the first little bit. And a little bit later on, and I just want to add this because I think it's really interesting. So he's talking about this, this arriving in this world with a birthright of gifts. And then he says, "We are disabused of original giftedness in the first half of our lives. Then, if we are awake, aware, and able to admit our loss, we spend the second half trying to recover and reclaim the gift we once possessed. When we lose track of true self, how can we pick up the trail? One way is to seek clues in stories from our younger years when we lived closer to our birthright gifts. A few years ago, I found some clues to myself in a time machine of sorts. A friend sent me a tattered copy of my high school newspaper from May 1957, in which I'd been interviewed about what I intended to do with my life. With the certainty to be expected of a high school senior, I told the interviewer that I would become a naval aviator and then take up a career in advertising. I was indeed wearing other people's faces, and I can tell you exactly whose they were." And so then he goes on to talk about the people's faces that he wore and put on as his own. So that just, awakens in me these questions about how we can go maybe to a truer sense of our original stories, or who we were maybe without the stories even, by looking for clues in our early younger years. So, for our listeners, if you think back at who you were before the age of 7 or some such thing, and you would describe that as a story, what are the clues that arise from there? But also this really interesting follow-up question around, well, what are the other faces that you wear or have been wearing that you could maybe place in your environment, right? So Parker J. Palmer goes on to give an example of a good friend of his father's who he looked up to, who was an aviator, a naval aviator, but he's actually a pacifist, right? Parker J. Palmer. So he says, it's funny, this contradiction. So maybe what are the people that were role models of sorts when you were young, or that you admired and then you took on parts of their story?
And then I think the question I would like to leave is about maybe if you think about stories and the myths that you have around your life, like I'm good at this or whatever it is, or I'm like this, is to look underneath the simplicity of that to see what complexity is underneath. What does that cover up? What are the nuances around or in underneath that story? So thank you for being with us today, and we look forward to seeing you on our next podcast.